When I first moved to Sunnyside Estates, I didn't expect to be embroiled in a battle over my rights, especially not over something as simple as a service dog. But from the moment I stepped foot into that neighborhood, I could feel the tension in the air, the kind of tension that bubbles just beneath the surface, ready to explode. The HOA president, Karen Whitfield, would soon make sure that was exactly what happened. I moved here because the location was perfect for my commute, and the walking trails were ideal for Maverick, my golden retriever. Maverick isn't just any dog, though. He's a lifeline. He's been by my side through thick and thin, helping me cope with the PTSD I developed during my time serving overseas. I'm not the kind of guy who enjoys making a scene, but Maverick is more than a companion. He's a necessity. He's well-trained, calm, and always by my side. So, when we moved in, I never imagined that this would be the source of so much trouble. I never thought I'd have to defend Maverick's presence in my own home. But when Karen first saw us, she didn't hesitate to question it. I was standing outside with Maverick on a sunny afternoon, enjoying a moment of peace when she approached me. I could already tell something was off. She was carrying a clipboard. Her eyes narrowed in a way that made me feel like I was already being judged. "I don't believe I approved a dog in this community," she said, almost snidely, while her eyes dropped to Maverick, who was sitting perfectly still by my side. I had no reason to get defensive, but I felt the urge to set her straight. I explained that Maverick was a service dog, not a pet, and that he was exempt from any pet restrictions under federal law. I thought that would be the end of it. After all, I was well aware of my rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I didn't think anyone in their right mind would challenge those laws. But Karen didn't take it well. She scoffed and muttered something about how people always seem to find loopholes, then walked away. The encounter stuck with me, though. I had a feeling that Karen wasn't the kind of person to back down easily. The next few weeks confirmed my suspicions. It wasn't long before I started getting notices, 3 in total, about minor, borderline, ridiculous infractions. My grass was a little too tall, my mailbox was the wrong shade of black, and my garbage can had been visible from the street for about 45 minutes after collection. All 3 notices were signed with Karen's name, followed by a smiley face that somehow made the whole thing feel more like a threat than a friendly reminder. I didn't argue with any of them. I wanted to avoid trouble, but there was a growing sense of unease in me. This wasn't just about keeping up appearances. I could feel the underlying tension, and I knew Karen wasn't going to let up. I figured these small infractions were only the beginning. I was right. It wasn't long before Karen proposed a new rule during the HOA meeting. She suggested that all animals, including service dogs, be required to be registered with the board and wear HOA-approved identification. I raised my hand and calmly explained that, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, service dogs are exempt from such requirements. Federal law, I pointed out, takes precedence over community rules when it comes to service animals. Before I could finish, Karen cut me off, looking at me with a mixture of irritation and arrogance. "Federal law doesn't override community standards," she snapped, dismissing my point as if it were a mere inconvenience. The room fell silent. I could see that some neighbors were uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up. I felt the weight of their silence, the unspoken understanding that Karen held power in this community. After the meeting, Karen approached me with a smirk on her face. "If you want to be difficult," she whispered, "I can be difficult too." Her words hung in the air like a warning, and I knew right then that this wasn't just about a few rules, it was personal for her. Then came the weekend that changed everything. I was sitting on my front porch, enjoying a peaceful morning with Maverick resting at my feet. It was the kind of moment I cherished, the kind of calm that helped me forget the chaos of the world for a little while. I was reading the newspaper when I noticed a shadow cast across my lawn. I looked up to see Karen standing there, her expression all business as usual. She was wearing her standard khaki shorts and polo shirt, holding a spray bottle in her hand. "Your dog is violating the new pet ordinance," she declared loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. I stood up, trying to remain calm, and reminded her that Maverick was a service dog. I told her that the new rule wasn't even official yet, and I assured her that, under federal law, she couldn't require any special identification. But Karen didn't back down. Instead, her face turned an angry shade of red as she stepped closer to me. "I'm tired of you military types thinking you're above the rules," she sneered, advancing toward Maverick. Before I could stop her, Karen sprayed something directly into Maverick's face. He yelped in pain and backed away, pawing at his eyes. In that moment, everything inside me snapped. I lunged forward, moving between Karen and Maverick, demanding to know what was in the spray bottle. "It's just a little vinegar and water solution," Karen said, as if it were no big deal. "It won't hurt him. Maybe now he'll learn to respect authority." My anger flared, but I did my best to stay calm. Years of military training had taught me how to manage my emotions under pressure, but I was furious. I immediately took Maverick inside, rinsed his eyes thoroughly, and checked to make sure he was okay. The vinegar had irritated his eyes, but thankfully there was no lasting damage. As soon as I was sure Maverick was fine, I did what I should have done from the start. I called the police. I told the dispatcher what had happened, emphasizing that interfering with a service animal was a federal offense. The dispatcher took down my information and assured me that officers would be dispatched. Less than 20 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived at my door. I explained everything to them, showing them Maverick's certification and training records, and I pointed out Karen's house across the street. One officer stayed with me while the other went to confront Karen. I could see through the window as Karen gestured wildly, her face a picture of indignation. But the officers weren't buying it. They came back and told me that Karen had admitted to spraying Maverick, though she claimed it was all in the name of enforcing community standards. The officers informed her that interfering with a service dog is a federal offense, and that she could face severe penalties for her actions, including jail time. They also told her that her actions qualified as animal cruelty under state law. Karen was placed under arrest, and I didn't hesitate to press charges. It wasn't just about what she did to Maverick. It was about sending a message that no one is above the law. It didn't take long for the situation to escalate further. After the arrest, I thought that maybe, just maybe, Karen would back off. But that wasn't how she operated. No, Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly. Her response was swift and vicious. Just a few days later, I received another notification from the HOA, this time for a new rule she was trying to push through. At the next HOA meeting, she made her move, an idea so brazen that I couldn't believe it was even being proposed. She suggested that all animals, including service dogs, be required to register with the HOA and wear some sort of official identification. The idea was absurd on so many levels that I thought for sure someone in the room would object. But Karen was on a roll. She had managed to convince enough of the board members that this would be a necessary step for the community. When I stood up to challenge her proposal, explaining that the Americans with Disabilities Act protected service dogs from these kinds of regulations, she simply dismissed me. "Federal law doesn't override community standards," Karen said, practically sneering as she interrupted me. The room went quiet. I could feel the eyes of my neighbors on me, and though some seemed uneasy, no one spoke up. It was as if they were waiting for me to back down, as if they feared crossing Karen would bring down her wrath upon them. I wasn't about to let that happen, though. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized how deeply entrenched Karen's influence was in the community. I felt like an outsider in a room full of people who, for one reason or another, were too afraid to stand up to her. As the meeting wound down, Karen made her usual round of polite threats. She approached me afterward, flashing a smirk that made my skin crawl. "If you want to be difficult," she whispered, leaning in just close enough so only I could hear, "I can be difficult too." I knew those weren't just words, they were a warning. I could feel the tension building, and something told me that Karen wasn't going to rest until she had made my life as miserable as possible. But I wasn't going to let her win. The fight wasn't over, and I was ready to stand my ground. It wasn't long before Karen's actions took an even darker turn. One weekend morning, I was sitting on my front porch with Maverick, enjoying the rare peace and quiet. The sun was just beginning to warm the day, and Maverick was lying next to me, resting his head on my feet. It was the kind of moment I treasured. Just me, my dog, and the world outside. I was reading the newspaper, trying to keep my mind off the stress of everything going on, when I felt a shadow fall across the yard. I looked up to find Karen standing there in her usual khaki shorts and polo shirt, holding a spray bottle in her hand. I could feel my blood run cold. Without even asking for permission or trying to engage in any conversation, she spoke up loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Your dog is violating the new pet ordinance," she announced, pointing at Maverick as if he were some kind of criminal. My heart sank. I stood up slowly, trying to keep my composure, and reminded her that Maverick was a service dog, not a pet. I even pointed out that the new rule hadn't even been officially passed yet, so there was no reason to enforce it. But Karen didn't care about any of that. "I'm tired of you military types thinking you're above the rules," she spat out, her face flushed with anger. "If you won't comply, I'll handle this myself." Before I could even process what was happening, she advanced toward my yard and sprayed something directly into Maverick's face. My stomach dropped as Maverick yelped and backed away, pouring at his eyes in distress. It all happened so fast that I didn't even have time to react. My heart was racing. I rushed forward, moving between Karen and Maverick, and demanded to know what was in the bottle she was holding. "Just a little vinegar and water solution," she said with a smirk, as though she were giving me some kind of lesson. "It won't hurt him, but maybe now he'll learn to respect authority." My mind was spinning with anger, but I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. I knew I had to keep it together. I couldn't let Karen win by allowing myself to be provoked. I grabbed Maverick, quickly ushering him inside, and rinsed his eyes out thoroughly to get rid of the vinegar solution. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The feeling of helplessness and rage mixed together in a way I couldn't quite describe. But what bothered me the most was the way Karen had treated Maverick. He wasn't just a dog to me, he was my partner, and the fact that she'd chosen to hurt him was unforgivable. After making sure Maverick was okay, I knew what I had to do. There was no turning back now. I called the police. The dispatcher answered, and I immediately reported what had happened. I didn't waste time explaining the situation in full detail. I just told them that my service dog had been assaulted, and that interfering with a service animal is a federal offense. I made sure they understood the gravity of the situation. The dispatcher assured me that officers would be dispatched right away. It wasn't long before the police arrived. 2 officers showed up at my door, and I explained everything to them. How Karen had sprayed Maverick in the face, how she had no right to do what she did, and how I had repeatedly tried to explain to her that Maverick was a service dog. I showed them his certification and training records and pointed across the street to Karen's house. One officer stayed with me to take my statement, while the other went to speak with Karen. From where I stood, I could see through the window as Karen began gesturing wildly, trying to make her case. Her face was a mix of indignation and frustration, but the officers didn't seem to be buying any of it. When they returned, they told me that Karen had admitted to spraying Maverick, though she claimed she was just enforcing the community standards. The officers weren't fooled. They informed Karen that interfering with a service animal was a federal crime, and they made it clear that she could face serious legal consequences. They also told her that her actions qualified as animal cruelty under state law. With no hesitation, they placed Karen under arrest. I didn't need to think twice about pressing charges. There was no way I was letting her get away with this. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, she screamed about how she was going to have me evicted, how the entire neighborhood would turn against me for standing up to her. I could hear some of the neighbors whispering, but it wasn't until later that I truly understood just how many people had been intimidated by her. As Karen was put into the police car, one of my neighbors came over to apologize. "We've all been afraid of her," they admitted, looking over at Maverick, who had recovered from the ordeal and was now resting calmly beside me. "We should have said something sooner." That moment really hit me. Karen had built this reign of terror around herself, and I'd been too focused on the situation to realize how many people had been silently suffering under her control. But now, with her finally facing the consequences, it felt like a weight had been lifted off the entire neighborhood. The days following Karen's arrest moved quickly, but not in a way I expected. The legal process seemed like it was speeding toward something inevitable. The police had already made it clear that Karen's actions were serious. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. She had crossed a line, and now there were consequences to face. I couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. Sure, I had wanted justice, but I never imagined it would come to this. Still, I knew that her arrest wasn't the end of the story. She was someone who had built a reputation of getting her way, and now that her world was starting to crumble, I couldn't help but wonder how far she would go to try to save herself. As the weeks passed, the community was buzzing with what had happened. People were still talking about it. Some were supportive, others more reserved, but everyone had an opinion. Most of the conversations I overheard focused on Karen's behavior, how she had terrorized the neighborhood with her overbearing rules and constant need for control. There were murmurs of relief, but there were also those who still feared her influence. It was a strange thing, seeing someone like Karen, a person who had held so much power in this community, be brought down by something as simple as doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. But she wasn't going to go down without a fight. I knew that. A few days after Karen's arrest, I received a call from the police. They informed me that Karen had been charged with interfering with a service animal, animal cruelty, and harassment. The seriousness of the charges sent a ripple through the community. I could feel the shift in the air. People started to talk more openly about what had happened, and a lot of them came forward to express their support. Even the neighbors who had remained silent for so long began to speak up. They were done being intimidated by Karen, and I was starting to realize just how many people had been under her thumb for far too long. Her grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and I was beginning to see that there was a lot more at stake than just a single confrontation. This was a turning point, and things weren't going to be the same around here. As the case moved forward, Karen's legal team made their first move. She showed up to her initial court appearance with a high-priced lawyer, clearly trying to put on a show of power. She was dressed in designer clothes, her usual air of superiority fully intact. But as the proceedings unfolded, it became clear that her case was unraveling fast. Every piece of evidence seemed to work against her. The judge was stern, not allowing her to sidestep the gravity of her actions. When the case was presented, it wasn't just about her spraying Maverick. It was about her blatant disregard for the law, her willingness to harm a disabled veteran service dog, and her deep-seated belief that she was above the rules. The prosecution didn't back down, and Karen's defense team seemed more and more uncomfortable as they realized they were losing ground. The turning point in the court case came when the judge, without missing a beat, reminded Karen that community rules could never supersede federal law, especially when it came to the rights of people with disabilities. It was a hard truth, and you could see the realization dawn on Karen's face as the weight of it settled in. She had been so focused on her own petty power that she hadn't stopped to consider the consequences of her actions. The law was clear, and she couldn't talk her way out of it. The judge made it crystal clear. Her behavior had endangered not only Maverick, but the very principles of fairness and equality that federal law sought to protect. The room fell silent as Karen's lawyer stammered, trying to negotiate for a lesser charge, but it was clear to everyone that Karen was going to face serious consequences. I didn't have to wait long for the outcome. The judge's sentence was swift, and the air in the courtroom seemed to shift as the words were read aloud. Karen was sentenced to 30 days in county jail, a $5,000 fine, 200 hours of community service at an animal shelter, and mandatory educational classes on disability rights. The severity of the sentence hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just about Karen being punished. It was about sending a message that people like her couldn't continue to trample on others simply because they thought they were entitled. I was finally seeing the consequences of her actions, and it was a feeling of justice I hadn't experienced in a long time. As the judge finished reading the sentence, Karen sat there, her face a strange mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. She had always thought she was untouchable, that she could bend the rules and manipulate everyone around her. But now she was the one facing the consequences of her behavior. I could see the realization slowly creep across her face, that this wasn't just a slap on the wrist. Her expression shifted from defiance to something else, something closer to fear, as she processed the reality of what she had done. She opened her mouth to protest, but the judge cut her off. "The most important rule, Miss Whitfield, is to respect the law," the judge said, his voice firm. "And the law protects service animals and the people who depend on them." As Karen was led away, the sense of relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming. I had fought for Maverick's rights, and in doing so, I had also fought for every person who had been intimidated or silenced by Karen's reign of terror. This wasn't just about one person being held accountable. It was about changing the culture of the community, about showing everyone that you don't have to put up with injustice just because someone's in a position of power. I could see a change happening in the neighborhood already. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak out were now standing taller, more confident in their right to challenge unfair rules and behavior. As the bailiff led Karen away in handcuffs, there was a moment when our eyes met. It was brief, but it spoke volumes. There was no longer the air of entitlement, no trace of the superiority she had always carried with her. Instead, there was something else, a recognition that she had finally met a force she couldn't control. As she was escorted out, her eyes briefly locked with mine, and I couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, she was finally beginning to understand the consequences of her actions. As I stood there in the courtroom, I felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't just the end of the case, it was the end of her reign in this community. And in a way, it was the beginning of something new, a new chapter for Maverick and me, and for the neighborhood that had, at last, started to stand up for itself. The legal battle with Karen wasn't over just because she had been sentenced. If anything, the case was only gaining momentum, and the ripple effect of her actions was still being felt throughout the neighborhood. While the court case was wrapping up, something unexpected happened, a development I hadn't seen coming. Just a few days after her sentencing, I got a call from a neighbor, someone I hadn't really spoken to much before. He told me that there was going to be an emergency HOA meeting. At first, I didn't think much of it, but when he mentioned that almost every homeowner in the neighborhood had been invited to attend, I started to wonder if this was a bigger deal than I realized. It didn't take long for the reason to become clear. People had been living in fear of Karen for years. They had silently suffered under her oppressive rule, watching her use her position to intimidate and manipulate the entire neighborhood. But after seeing Karen brought down in court, the fear began to fade. Now, they were ready to take action. When the day of the meeting came, I walked into the room with Maverick by my side. The atmosphere was unlike any meeting I'd been to before. There was an energy in the air, something charged with anticipation. The entire room was filled with homeowners, many of whom had never said a word against Karen before. It was a huge turnout, and I could feel the tension in the room. It wasn't just about Karen's actions anymore. It was about the future of the community and what they were going to do to ensure that something like this never happened again. As I sat down, I could feel the eyes of the room on me, and it was clear that the weight of what had happened was finally sinking in for everyone. They had been waiting for someone to take a stand, and I was that person. But I wasn't in this alone anymore. The room was full of people who had come to the realization that Karen's grip on the neighborhood wasn't just about power, it was about fear. And now, they were done being afraid. The meeting started with the usual pleasantries, but it didn't take long for the vice president of the board to bring up Karen's actions. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for, and the room grew silent as he made his announcement. He proposed a vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership. The room exploded into murmurs, and for the first time in a long time, people began speaking up. They talked about how Karen's reckless behavior had put the entire community at risk, how she had subjected them all to her petty power struggles and used her position to enforce ridiculous rules that had no real basis in law. The vice president pointed out how Karen's actions had left the neighborhood exposed to legal liabilities and potential lawsuits. It was clear that her leadership had created a toxic environment, and the people in the room were no longer willing to tolerate it. The vote of no confidence wasn't just symbolic. It was a chance for the community to reclaim control. As the vote was called, I could see the faces of my neighbors light up with the hope that something was finally going to change. The results were unanimous. Karen was out. I didn't know it at the time, but her removal from the board was only the beginning of what was to come. The changes that followed were swift and satisfying. The board called for a reorganization of leadership, and within days, a new team had been put in place. It wasn't just about Karen's removal. It was about rebuilding the community from the ground up, creating a space where the homeowners could feel safe and respected, rather than constantly looking over their shoulders. The entire atmosphere in Sunnyside Estates shifted. People who had previously been too afraid to speak up now felt empowered. The change was palpable, and as I watched the transformation unfold, I felt a sense of pride. Not just for Maverick and me, but for everyone who had come together to make a stand. As if the universe was trying to reinforce the lesson Karen needed to learn, the criminal case against her moved forward quickly, and the legal consequences of her actions became clearer and clearer. Despite her lawyer's best efforts to minimize the charges, the evidence was overwhelming. There was no way around it. Karen had broken the law, and now she was facing the consequences. Her trial was a spectacle, no doubt about it. She showed up in the same designer clothes she always wore, clearly trying to maintain her image of power. But the courtroom wasn't the place for her to flaunt her wealth or status. As the trial went on, it became clear that Karen's defense couldn't hold up. Every witness who spoke, every piece of evidence presented, painted a picture of a woman who had overstepped her boundaries in a big way. The judge was firm, not letting Karen's attempts to deflect or shift blame gain any traction. It wasn't just about the violation against Maverick anymore. It was about her disregard for the laws meant to protect people like me, the violation of trust, and the outright cruelty she had inflicted on a defenseless animal. When the verdict was read, I could see Karen's face change. It was the first time I saw real shock on her face, the kind of shock that comes with the sudden realization that all her manipulation and posturing had come to nothing. The sentence was handed down quickly, without much fanfare, but the weight of it was undeniable. Karen was sentenced to 30 days in county jail, a $5,000 fine, 200 hours of community service at an animal shelter, and mandatory classes on disability rights. Her mouth opened in protest, but no one was listening anymore. The judge didn't entertain any further excuses. There was no sympathy for her entitlement or her belief that she could do whatever she wanted. She had crossed a line, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. The courtroom was quiet as Karen processed the reality of what was happening. I watched as her face cycled through shock, disbelief, and finally, a quiet understanding. There was no escaping the truth anymore. The law had spoken, and there was no turning back. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. It wasn't just about the sentence she had received. It was about what it represented. It was a message to her, to the community, and to anyone else who thought they could get away with mistreating others because they thought they were untouchable. As Karen disappeared from view, I looked down at Maverick, who was still by my side, calm and steady as always. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless, for anyone who had ever been intimidated by someone like Karen. She had spent so long trying to break people down, but now she had finally met someone who wouldn't back down. And in the end, that's what had made all the difference.